Hey, everybody. We are back for another episode of the Ship Show series. Today is April 27th, 2023, and this is episode number 15 in our yearly series. So, we have a great show for you today, and we feel the timing is perfect to discuss China Russia versus the US and EU and how global shipping is slowly splitting in two and why China sourcing is tied to the largest supply chain risk of 2023. But before we jump into that, I want to welcome back my co host, Jason Brand, who was kicking it down in Cancun last week. And Jason, so welcome back. And how was Cancun and how are you doing?
I am doing great. Cancun was the first time I had been there. My wife and her best friend scheduled the trip, and it did not disappoint. Definitely gave me a different Mexico experience from what I'm used to, but it was a really good time. I'm doing fantastic. You know, I think we talked about this earlier. I moved lately, so I've only got limited dress shirts that I can locate that aren't wrinkled. So you might see me in a similar set of clothes for a little while, but other than that, I'm doing fantastic.
Thanks, Jay. So why don't we take the deep dive? And, everyone, I think really everyone is aware that the Taiwan tensions are really the latest flashpoint that is sort of, reshaping global trade, the geopolitics with this whole situation and the dichotomy between Taiwan and China is really just, causing a lot of ripple effects. And I think, last summer's meeting with the Taiwanese president when Speaker Pelosi went down to Taiwan, I mean, we all remember that, soon as she, left Taiwan, the Chinese had live fire exercises. And
Mhm.
then just 10 days ago, Speaker McCarthy went down to Taiwan to meet with, I won't even try to pronounce the prime minister's name, but to meet with the Taiwanese PM president. And again, the Chinese military had large scale exercises in the Strait of Taiwan. So, I mean, I think the situation's becoming really increasingly tense. And
Mhm.
everyone's got to remember that 40% of the Asia Pacific containerized freight transits through the Straits of Taiwan. And I think it's really an indication of the ever worsening relations between China and the US. And it really took another big step down after February spy balloon incidents
Yeah.
that everyone is familiar with, around the country, all of our listeners.
Mhm.
And it's really part of the evolving story with international trade and, how shipping fleets and cargo flows are really becoming increasingly divided.
Yeah.
Jason, I don't know if you have anything you want to add there.
No, I mean, I think it's a great point to start on too, talking about Taiwan, because it's been such a long time coming, and we've really, I mean, I've got some stuff I'll mention a little bit later. I was kind of mentioning it to Anthony earlier, but like the Taiwan situation has been evolving for a while, but our relations with China have been degrading for obviously, quite long. If you go back to prior to the 301 tariffs, if you remember how all this started, there was I mean, we're still dealing with this, but intellectual property issues. And I had a dinner, I want to say back in like 2014 with an old furniture company owner who'd become a consultant specifically for Chinese companies who were furniture manufacturers. He'd go over and he'd consult with them. He'd also consult with US companies using Chinese suppliers. And he had a very, very strong opinion on some of the concerns around just intellectual property and how much of a challenge it was. China's been the manufacturer of the world for a very, very long time, but they've also advanced very far. And I don't think they like being treated the way they used to. And so they're kind of trying to stand their ground with this Taiwan situation. And honestly, I mean, gosh, I remember that when we sent that delegation over to Taiwan. Oh man, Anthony, you and me, we had a show coming up, and we were like, I don't even know how to tackle
Yeah,
this. This could be the
yeah,
Gray Swan event right now. So,
yeah.
really, really, I mean, critical thing to mention. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and thanks, Jay. And I think the reason why we open with that is because we do know that last year, the World Trade Organization warned about a worst case scenario, and they called it, it's interesting, they called it long run decoupling. And that involved the disintegration of the global economy into two separate trading blocks, which is some of the stuff that Jason and I want to touch on today. And what was really interesting is the WTO published a paper this January, which I had the opportunity to read a few times, and they analyzed the outcome called geopolitical rivalry, featuring, and this is an interesting term, a bipolar trade war that really would have severe consequences for the future GDP of not only the United States, but you know, you know,
Yeah.
many countries around the
Mhm.
world and their trade volumes. And they looked at two scenarios: full rivalry, in which all countries join either the Western or Eastern trade bloc, and partial rivalry, in which some countries remain neutral and trade with both blocs. And the partial rivalry scenario should really sound familiar to everyone, because if you're following the current developments in ocean shipping, most visibly in the container and the dry bulk shipping market, you'll see there's a lot of that going on right now. And the geopolitics is really splintering global shipping systems in two, with the US and the EU leading one side and China and Russia leading the other, and some countries trying to stay in the middle and play both sides and keep their options open. So, Jay, I know you might have some comments. So,
Yeah. Do you mind if I go into a little bit here?
yeah,
Because I
please.
do have some comments.
Yeah,
It's
please. Go ahead.
and I kind of want to just address my opinions on this kind of right on the nose. Well, when we talk about China, Russia, and the US EU trading blocks, it's not like the European Union is going to become the replacement for China for the US, right? It's not going to be our, China trading partner of the future. And the same thing goes for China and Russia. China may be more of that. They are more of that right now to Russia. But going forward, the next 20 years for China are going to be very different than the last 20 years. And I think that's kind of the key point here. This idea of these two rival trading blocks. Yes, it's true, but you got to think about it more as two rival supply chain ecosystems. And really, that division, it hurts all of us. So, like, you have to think about it this way. Imagine versus the idea of proxy wars, like what's been happening in Ukraine right now. Imagine being involved in hundreds of proxy trade wars at the same time. And like, yes, this happens all the time. It's happened in the past, it's happening now, but it would be amped up to a new level because the idea of these two super powerful rivaling blocks kind of playing tug of war off of each of these countries and the trade that they can offer, it just screams business risk, quite frankly. And business risk is, the big calculation for making business decisions. You can't make a decision based on what you can guarantee for 6 months, a year, 4 years. You need something that you can do investment in and expect a return over time, right? And so I know I'm being a bit dramatic, and the likelihood is that it's not going to be like this country will only trade with this block, this country will only trade with this block. That's likely not the reality. But in truth, what probably will be happening is serious preferential treatment towards one or the other at the detriment of the other. And that's it's just it's a challenge, and it's something that we really are going to have to cover. And I hope we don't get to that point. I think this was inevitable, getting to a point where China kind of wants to step out of the role that they've been in for a while. And this opportunity with Russia, who obviously aligns with their views substantially more than we do. I mean, they have a long history together. It kind of made sense, right? They were able to step up and stoke up the volume and get rid of some of the challenges we were giving them, such as the 301 tariffs. But, you know, there's a lot to cover on this. Back to you for a little. There's more I want to unpack, but I want to dice it up.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you. As always, it's a pleasure. So, everyone, let's talk about, it's a good segue, Jason's comments. Let's talk about container shipping and this new phenomenon that is being talked about in the industry called the friend shoring effect. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with Drury, which is a UK-based consultancy firm. They've been around a long time, and we like to read a lot of um, their opinions. And they recently highlighted the effects of geopolitical unrest on container shippings in a report that was just released just this past Tuesday. And it's really interesting because the superpower grudge match that they referred to between the US and China has been brought to a boiling point by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And, you know, there was a lot of talk about the relationship that Russian President Putin has with China and how they're becoming a real, um, ally to China, and this whole dichotomy of how this is widening the geopolitical schism and bringing more countries over to China's side. And I think the geopolitics has heightened the focus on friend shoring, which is container trade between trusted countries that share common values. Okay. So in friend shoring, it becomes the standard trading model. Ocean carriers are going to need to start thinking creatively about how they can continue to serve both sides of the divide. And it's also going to put countries, for example, like Vietnam and India, in a very awkward predicament. Let's face it, they're understandably trying to play both sides at the moment. But there's going to come a time when China or the US will decide for themselves if they are one of their friends or not. And, you know, the partial rivalry pattern seen in the shipping markets today could evolve into a full rivalry with no one able to play in the middle anymore. Jay, I don't know if you have anything you want to add, or
Yeah,
you
yeah, I could dive into it because there is
please.
an interesting kind of point with French storing going on, and kind of how we want to obviously do that. We'd like to be resourcing in these different environments, but I think what's interesting is we've also got some close trading partners which we've been losing over time, actually, quite frankly, to China. So really, over the past 20 plus years in South America, um, and this is directly related to trading with China. Right now, there's only two countries in South America that recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. And if you go back to 20 years ago, that number was over 10 countries at the start of the 21st century. So you can kind of see how, as China became, a superpower as far as exports and imports go, they also have spread influence on some of their views and ideology. And if you add to this, you can kind of move to other countries, because this idea and some of the trade that's been happening has been fruitful for a lot of these South American countries who quite frankly we have trade agreements with. So Brazil, when we compare how the U.S. trades with Brazil versus how the U.S. or excuse me Brazil trades with China, volumes tell a pretty big story. So Brazil exports roughly 90 billion worth of goods a year to China. In comparison to the US, Brazil's only exporting about 37 billion, so less than half, substantially shifting obviously to China. So if you can kind of imagine from Brazil's standpoint, which one of those trading partners, if they had to lose one, would they want to lose? Just a numbers game, it would be the US. Now, that being said, we both fulfill very different trading needs. So an example of this is the main things that China is importing from Brazil are, raw materials like iron ore and agricultural goods like soybeans. While the United States, we are importing a lot of manufactured goods. We're importing modified metal products such as metal tubing or those metal rolls as well. And the problem there for us, when we look at the 37 billion versus the 90 billion, is quite frankly, if you're talking about raw materials or agricultural goods, you'll be able to produce that easy more easily than more manufactured goods. So you also are dealing with different constraints. Something to definitely consider.
No, Jason, those are really good points, and it's really interesting to listen to that data and about the trade. So that was great. But let's try to talk about a little bit more about the container ships and container shipping and how that ties in. So, just a real quick touch point. So, let's talk about those container ships dedicated to Russian trade. So, the splitting of the fleet, especially the tanker fleet. A lot of people think of container ships, but in global shipping, everyone forgets about the liquid gas carriers and the oil tankers and the bulk carriers and and the different types of vessels out there. And so that is really been very apparent. To a much lesser degree in container shipping, but almost all container shipping lines, with the notable exception of MSC, has ceased serving Russian ports. So shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, many of the container ship lines stopped calling the ports in Russia. So
Mhm.
other ship operators are now filling those gaps. Other smaller container ship lines and other types of bulk carriers and oil tankers and liquid gas carriers. They're trying to fill those gaps left by those departed ocean carriers, but MSC keeps on continuing to trade with Russia, and with that service going into New York. But it's interesting to see how it can do that, considering the overall picture. Now, you know, geopolitically, there's a lot of downsides here for container shipping, and the geopolitical unrest really poses a high risk to the whole future of container shipping demand. And reshoring of manufacturing to the U.S. and nearshoring to Mexico would reduce that trans-Pacific volume. But furthermore, container shipping is really more exposed than tanker shipping to the global GDP. And a lot of economists have really argued negatively, that it's been affected by these geopolitical rivalries versus the multilateral cooperation. But, you know, to try to predict the future of container shipping, and see what the supply of ships is, and you look at the world economy, we know the order book. We know how many carriers have ordered so many new vessels, and now with the market, bottom falling out with an 80% correction, we're seeing vessels scrapped. We're seeing orders that for new ships that were placed being canceled now. It's a real big unknown to the world economy. And I think the fallout from a war involving China would be as extreme or more extreme for container shipping than for tanker shipping. Okay. So, how do you take that portion of the global trade that moves through the South China Seas today and say, okay, we're just going to stop that because there's a live war going on? Well, you can't, you know, and America remains extremely dependent on containerized imports from China. And U.S. Customs data shows that imports from China represented 30% of the total U.S. imports in 2022. So, if you add it all up, it looks like cargo flows and shipping fleets are on a path, um, really, looks like they're on a path towards fragmentation. And the World Trade Organization warned that it's a whole new world trade outlook. Fragmentation really remains a significant threat, which really is going to hinder economic growth and reduce living standards all over the world in the long term. And I think at this point right now, I'm going to shift it back to Jay, but it's really a good segue as we move into why this China sourcing is tied to the largest supply chain risk of 2023. But Jay, back to you for your comments and any additions.
Yeah, no, honestly, I just want to kind of plug in to write what you were saying. So, thinking about container shipping, I think we saw a situation where we were extremely dependent on container shipping. And Anthony and I, prior to the pandemic, already had our gripes about the container ship cartels, as we call them. And, some of the practices that they were doing just were they were a large challenge for us in the supply chain world. Obviously, we love ocean shipping. It's a very cost-effective means of shipping product. But when you're in a situation where there's not enough competition, the shipper is going to lose. And this fragmentation that Anthony's talking about really poses a big threat on reducing competition even more. We're going to have situations where obviously we're already dealing with all the alliances. Yes, we have an alliance that's splitting up, but if we are working with these two separate supply chain ecosystems, you will see container ships serve one or the other simply because that's where the lanes are going to be. New main lanes are going to be drawn. So as a result, yes, you're not going to have as many options. And when you don't have as many options, when a GRI comes through, or just really whatever a container ship has, container shipping line has available, you're going to have to deal with. And then you're dealing with little micro issues with supply and demand when, generally speaking, on the macro level, we were able to work with it. Now, one final point before I give it back to Anthony. Obviously, even given the vast amount of supply available and the low amount of demand, container ships working together are able to manipulate the markets and keep those rates from completely falling to the floor. But it's not this time period we're worried about. We're worried about when demand comes back in a fragmented environment.
Absolutely. And let's tie this one up. And I know Jason has a few more things he wants to unpack real quick about some of the deals with batteries and things like that. But you know, when we think about why this whole topic is going to become front and center for the remainder of this year, why China sourcing is tied to the largest supply chain risk of 2023, I read an interesting report that there is a 90% risk score that the possibility of delays and cancellations from China based suppliers um, uh, are, the likelihood of localized COVID disruptions in that country is still very high. Even though we're not hearing a lot about it right now, this is still a big risk, okay, of cancellations from China based suppliers, meaning these factories in China that are producing many of these products. We start to see an uptick in CV19 again. And with China's zero tolerance policy with CV19, internally there, it really could cause a lot of disruptions. And I think it's important that many of you get assurances from your tier one suppliers that don't do business with China. That they're going to be able to meet your needs, and you need to make sure that you have sufficient protection, because those suppliers probably don't have the visibility through their entire supply network. And I also read a report pointed to the cybercrime and the ESG violations and high commodity prices from Europe, stemming from energy shortages and many of the financial insolvencies in the banking industry that are occurring right now with Deutsche Bank and Swiss Bank in supply chains. Is really another key risk that are going to be facing companies this year. This whole banking crisis is going to tie into global supply chain as we move forward. And, while US leaders in both major political parties have framed the concentration of production in China in geopolitics and policy terms, companies have faced more practical business risk from an over reliance on China for manufacturing in recent years. And, whether it's, has something to do with CV19, I think we counted 85 lockdowns in China in 2022, and 18 of those just came in the month of December just last year. So,
Yeah.
it's really amazing. But Jay, I know you have some other things you want to unpack. So why don't you
No, no,
segue
no.
into that?
I am loving it. No, I think if you've watched this show for a while, I don't love getting too doom and gloom. But at the end of the day, we have seen a couple years of just some really, really challenging problems to overcome. And if our word isn't good enough, look at the ILWU. Look how long it took for them to come to
Yeah,
an agreement,
yeah,
and look at all the other unions that have had to go through this situation. Obviously, there's inflation. That's a cause, but it's all connected. So it is a very challenging time. It's a time of change right now. And looking at the kind of positive of this, you know, the fact that, yes, China has become a closer trading partner with Russia. Yes, the stories about disengaging with China, we've got data looking back through the pandemic, looking at comparison to volume, and we are disengaging with China. And right now, obviously, with this lull, it's hard to see some really solid information. We kind of have to wait till demand comes back, wait a full year, and then kind of see where we're at. But from what we saw when we had enough demand, we're seeing that occur. And there is actually a positive here. And that's that really we need backup plans for a lot of the goods that we produce and a lot of the things that we need. We need a secondary source. And I think for a very long time, we were stuck in a situation. I mean, Anthony and I have both seen it ourselves, where
Yeah.
large companies are 100% reliant on China or their Chinese affiliate for supplying their needs. And if something happened, which we saw, they were just unable to do anything about it. And that's a huge risk. And we never had to deal with that because working with China has always been a white glove treatment most of the time for a lot of companies. Now, there are a couple things though that have been happening that have been kind of bolstering this US EU relationship. And I think a great example of that is really this Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration pushed through. It's actually all the way back in last summer. And actually, some of the finite rules are going to be coming out. Actually, they already came out. I think that was early April. So, but a couple of the things in that bill really are encouraging EU companies to start to source from North America specifically, but also in a smaller way, South America, and that's on multiple different ways, sourcing from a manufacturing standpoint and sourcing from a raw material standpoint. So, more specifically, the bill calls for two main things in relation to battery car production. So the first half is going to be of the bill is contingent on 40% of the value of critical minerals in the battery being extracted or processed in the United States or another country with a US free trade agreement, or at a very minimum, recycled in the US. Now, this is a direct jab at China. The reason why is 80% of our rare earth minerals come from China right now.
Yep.
So requiring 40% from North America or one of our free trade countries is it's huge. It's a really big shift. And actually, we saw that Canada announced they had the ability to mine some of these rare earth minerals, and immediately VW jumped in and said, "We will invest. We will set up a plant, and we will work on this." So that's the first part of the bill. The second part of the bill looks at the manufacturing and assembly, and it requires that 50% of the battery, so not the rare earth minerals, but the battery itself, is assembled or manufactured in North America. And that's a pretty big push for kind of shifting people away from the general area where they had been getting this stuff done. And on top of that, and this happened right around the same time that we had the delegation go over to Taiwan, we had a bill go out around semiconductors. And that was to bring semiconductor production to the US and bolster it as well. We've been lagging behind. Semiconductor production is notoriously very expensive to get into, and the dollars you throw in it's a very clear equation. You need to pay a lot to get a decent amount. So yeah, but that's some of the things that are happening right now. We're going to see this really heat up in the next couple months. I mean, you're going to have to keep watching us because there's a lot of stuff going on in supply chain right now from all of these different union negotiations, all these contracts that have to be renewed, and it's just the timing is tough with the low demand. But on top of that, we've got a lot of global geopolitical stuff happening. So we'll try to give you guys a two-layered approach, talking about, hey, on the front lines, here's what's going on, and hey, here's the 3 month, 6 month, and 1 year expectations.
Jay, well said. I mean, some great feedback there. And I think as we bring it home in the last minute, listen, folks, in closing, we are in the end game of Made in China. The outbreaks of CV-19, the geopolitical tensions have really underscored the urgent need to look beyond cost and diversify your production to alternate locations around the world that can meet your quality standards and specifications to lower the risk of disruptions. For example, multinationals, including Apple and Tesla, are facing severe disruptions through the supply chains in China right now, with some of the things going on in China, particularly in Beijing. So, while China's relative advantages as a cheap manufacturing hub are waning, more international groups will be looking to diversify production to alternate locations. And I think there's going to be a wider geopolitical decoupling that also threatens global trade. So executives should be finding ways to improve the resilience of their supply chain and not just lower costs to ensure that it, doesn't come down to a snarl. So that's what we got for you today. Next week, we are going to have the FMR, the Freight Market Roundup. We're going to have a lot of great stuff on there. Jay usually puts a great agenda together for the FMR. I know he's going to be talking about the ILWU and some things going on there. And then the week of May 11th, we're going to have our great partners, Meridian Freight UK, on board to talk about what they do for supply chain solutions and how they can help our clients out there. So I think it's that time of the show, Jay.
It is that time of the show, Anthony. Say it with me.
Make it a great day and make it a great week.
Woo! Thanks, everybody.
Take care, guys.